By the end of the 1930s, two American surgeons had become increasingly concerned by the increase in the number of their patients with lung cancer.
It had become more frequent than cancer of the stomach, which was considered one of the common cancers at that time. And so that was very impressive. Here it is, from 1912 to 1939, you see, a period of just a couple of decades, a disease has now become from the rarest of diseases to one of the most common. And that's what impressed us tremendously.
Michael DeBakey, today an internationally renowned heart surgeon, soon became convinced of a connection between the lung cancers and cigarettes.
We were very impressed by the fact that virtually all the patients were long-term heavy smokers, with the exception of two women in the entire series.
DeBakey's partner at the time wrote to the Surgeon General and unsuccessfully tried to engage his medical colleagues in the subject.
It was frustrating not to be, in a sense, taken very seriously. We were serious, but in general there was great skepticism about our belief, and that was frustrating because we thought we had pretty good evidence. The idea that this was an unhealthy habit was simply not acceptable. Everybody was smoking.
During World War II, the cigarette habit exploded. A world war meant a world market for the product. In a major deal with the United States, Britain spent more on tobacco than on tanks or ships or planes.
Cigarettes were very important for troops during the war. It wasn't possible really for a warship, to leave port without an adequate supply of smoking tobacco, cigarettes. And every soldier had to have cigarettes in his rations. We were absolutely essential for the morale of the troops.
The Overseas League organized a tobacco fund quite early in the war to provide smokes for the services. And the first donor was His Majesty the King. Smokes are in camp and the boys feel as delighted as you do.
Even as Britain prepared for a German invasion, cigarettes weren't far from the planners' minds. Here, deep beneath Whitehall in the cabinet war rooms, Winston Churchill and his senior advisors ran the war. Britain's planners regarded maintaining the supply of cigarettes a top priority. They considered tobacco a necessity, not only for the troops, but also for civilians back home. Such a necessity, in fact, that a secret plan provided for every citizen to be supplied with 45 cigarettes a week in the event of invasion. Cigarettes were not rationed in Britain during the war, but there were shortages. They became a currency in their own right, a lucrative business for those prepared to exploit it.
Cigarettes were like gold dust, and you went out thieving to get hundreds of thousands of them. And the buyers who bought the cigarettes off you literally bit your hand off to buy them off you. It was, fantastic.
Frankie Frazier served 3.5 years in prison for stealing cigarettes. As a teenager during the war, he understood their value.
Everybody wanted to smoke then, with the bombing and doodle bubs and V2s and one thing and another. Their loved ones in the army abroad, and wives and that working. Everybody wanted to smoke. I'll never forgive Hitler for surrendering during the war. It were wonderful days. They were my best pal, my best friend. Thank God for cigarettes.
The Second World War internationalized American cigarette brands like Lucky Strike. Everywhere American troops went, so did their cigarettes. They even found their way into Hitler's Germany.
We can well imagine how German audiences would have cheered this story had it reached their cinemas, and how they would have gloated over their men at the front enjoying a really decent smoke at last from captured American cigarettes and cigars.
By the end of the war, 82% of British men smoked.
Everything possible was done for them, cigarettes and a snack for each man on his way home.
The returning troops didn't realize they were coming home to a newly emerging epidemic disease, lung cancer. In post-war Britain, public health officials studied autopsy results and found evidence of an epidemic. Lung cancer in men had increased 5,000% in less than 40 years, surpassing prostate and stomach cancer. No one knew what was causing it. The officials told Richard Dahl, a young medical statistician and cigarette smoker, to find the cause of the epidemic. Experts considered air pollution the likeliest explanation, especially given the increasing reliance on automobiles.
Motor traffic was an obvious possible explanation, and the tarring of roads, because they had become much more common. And indeed, that was what I would have put my money on if I'd had to bet at the time before we started the study.
But it wasn't long before Richard Dahl, through his survey of 5,000 patients in British hospitals, identified a relationship between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer.
The association was strong enough to make me give up smoking in the course of the study. You see, we found that people who were smoking over 25 cigarettes a day, they had 30 times the risk of developing lung cancer as a non-smoker. Our final conclusion was definitely that smoking cigarettes was a cause, and an important cause, of cancer of the lung.
It was a great shock. We had never thought of tobacco as being a danger to health. In fact, we thought tobacco was a beneficial product. And this obviously was a great shock to us, and we were at first totally disbelieving of it.
I read this report. I read it cynically, because I'd had several comments to me. Have you read this nonsense, old boy, that these doctor chappies are coming out with? And so I read it in that frame of mind, and instead of which I began to think, what are we doing? We're killing people. Should this be happening? And I expected to find everyone as concerned as I was and worried as I was. And instead of which, I found just the opposite. Instead of saying, is this true? If so, what are we to do? Should we start research to counter it? Should we try to get a new form of cigarette? Instead of that reaction, the reaction was, how can we rubbish this?
Imperial Tobacco, makers of Players cigarettes and the largest manufacturer in Britain, set out to undermine Dahl's findings.
The Imperial Tobacco Company took a rather different view from us. They took the view that the Dahl report was not true and they would do nothing about it. We were a little less sceptical than that.
The company policy was that we as tobacco manufacturers were not qualified to make any medical judgments. Now that was the company's stance on that, and I believe it was absolutely right, that and has stood the test of time. So that has always been my line. I'm not a doctor, I'm not qualified, and I wouldn't presume to make any judgments.
As the doctors and nurses relax in the open space that surrounds their hospital of tents, a dusty paddy field in summer and a swampy marsh in winter, they take a welcome breather before the next emergency case arrives.
In fact, by the middle of the century, most doctors smoked heavily. Some physicians even emphasized the medicinal benefits of cigarettes as a reliever of stress. In its advertisements, the tobacco industry used doctors and their fondness for smoking to reassure the public. The emphasis was on relieving throat irritation, not curing disease. Indeed, the medical profession also was employed to cast doubt on the link between cancer and smoking.
Last thing we wanted was people to question smoking. We had, for instance, one doctor who was a Harley Street, very good address, and we knew that he could be relied on to write to the Times whenever there was anything new, saying, this is not true, it's sheer imagination, it's scaremongering. And it was thoroughly, thoroughly cynical.
Americans enjoying the fruits of a strong post-war economy were oblivious to such health fears. Some, like 17-year-old Janet Sackman, even found work promoting a product that would eventually take its toll.
When I was a teenager, a gentleman stopped me on a beach and told me to go down to see the modeling agency. He thought I'd be a good all-American girl type.
Janet became the lucky strike girl. They suggested she start smoking to look more convincing when handling the product.
There was a gentleman there from the tobacco companies. Then he asked me if I smoked. And I said, no, I don't. Then he said, you're an up-and-coming model. It would be a good idea if you learned how to hold a cigarette. And after that, I started to smoke.
Janet soon had a 35-cigarette-a-day habit.
Everyone smoked. So we didn't know what it could do.